All right, let's talk about cities. So we'll basically do 2 sessions this afternoon. The first, I want to talk about cities generally. And then the second, we're going to talk about what does it look like to serve or to engage as a Christian in your city. For some of this, I'll refer to London specifically because that's my context. But what I would encourage you guys to do is use my case study as an example and actually see how you can do some of this work yourself in identifying trends and spiritual patterns in a city like Addis. So that work is for you to do, but I'll give you London as a case study. So 3 things we want to do in this first session, and then we'll have another break. I want to talk to you about the importance of cities. We're going to use London as a case, and then I'm going to give you some instruction or guidance about why you should love your city, which should be pretty obvious to you, but we'll spend a little time thinking about that. So first, why are cities important? What would you say before I walk through the handout? Why are cities important places for gospel ministry? Where in Canada are you going?
Toronto.
Where?
Toronto.
You're going to Toronto, big city, important place, good.
I think.
Yeah. So density, travel of the gospel, yeah? Yeah, they say as the city goes, so goes the nation. So the culture of America, the stuff that people think is cool, the media that people consume is produced in LA, Hollywood, right? DC, certainly New York, maybe Boston. Those are the big cities. So Addis is going to shape Ethiopia and maybe other parts of Africa because stuff's going to emanate from here. That's going to change lots of people's lives. Yes, Cor? Yeah. So by exposure to significant difference, there's an openness and a kind of even a humility that comes. That's right. That's good. Yeah, so cities attract people who have power. Power might be skill set, power might be education, power might be wealth. And then because people with lots of power congregate in dense areas, those places become hyper producers of culture. They become culture transmitters in ways that a smaller region or a smaller village could not do simply because they don't have as much of the catalytic stuff going on. You also know that cities, because you bring together people who are experts in very different fields, they produce things more quickly. So if you're in finance, but you want to invest in some kind of thing that will bring change in the world, you're going to need a lawyer, and you're going to need a marketer, and you're going to need someone to do your design. That those people all live in the city, and so you can work together in a way that would be much quicker than you could if you were in another place, in another area. And so the sharing of ideas, everyone gets smarter, in theory. Well, you guys have said a lot of this, but let's talk about what a city is. So if I were to ask you what makes a city distinct from a town or a village, what would you say? And historically, there have been, this is not necessarily biblical, but there are 5 things that have distinguished cities from places that weren't called cities. One is density. Cities are filled with people. Density itself doesn't make something a city, but it's this density that's interspersed with proximity. So I've learned from you guys over the past couple of days that Addis keeps growing. And what is that? It's we have too many people in too close of space. And so we need to get more land. We need to get more space for those people. But that's what makes a city a city. It's density with proximity. New York, if you've ever been there, is the chief example of, I mean, some Asian cities are like this too, but where do they go? When you need to add more people, where do you go? You just go up, right? You get vertical. So cities are places with density, but also proximity. A lot of people living very close to each other. Cities are also places of safety and stability. So especially in ancient times, what made a city was it had a wall. And the wall was meant to keep you safe. And to this day, even though cities aren't necessarily always safer places, sometimes people talk about crime in cities or things like that. In theory, cities are still places that if you're a refugee, if you're on hard times, you want to get to a city because you know there will be more opportunity for you there. And so that's why most migrants or immigrants end up first landing in a city. They're intended to be places of refuge. Diversity. I say here in the handout as an example, cities are incredibly diverse places. So I often say to people, just imagine trying to find a kind of food that you can't eat in London. It would be almost impossible. Almost every type of cuisine is represented because those people all live there. I was telling you, Mikey, earlier, because he brought me a very kind lunch today with injera and the chickpea stew. It was fantastic. So good. But I was saying that I probably at least once a month, if not more than that, go to this incredible Ethiopian restaurant right near King's Cross Station in central London, because one of the co-pastors of my church is an Ethiopian man, and we go get Ethiopian food all the time. That's amazing to me that I can live in London and have quality Ethiopian food. But that's an example of what cities do, is they attract all kinds of diversity, which brings with it the cultures of the people who are there. So cities are places of diversity, not just racial or ethnic, but all the culture that comes with it. And then, of course, productivity and creativity. We've said this, but cities are always places of entrepreneurship, and they create things because you get starters, you get builders in the same town. They work together, they catalyze ideas, and out from that comes change and culture renewal. So that's more or less what a city is. What you need to know is the world is becoming increasingly urban. By the 21st century, people will be living, the 21st century is a time in which people have been moving into cities faster than people have been leaving them. So generally, as the world population grows, that is happening in cities. He also writes that it's expected that the world's population will eventually level off at more than 80% urban by 2100. Now, if you're caring about the ministry of the gospel, you should take note of that, right? We want to serve people, and most people are going to be living in cities, and many people now are moving towards cities. When the pandemic came, I don't know what it was like in Addis, but in New York and also in London, cities started to empty, and everybody said, this is the doom of the city. All that stuff where people thought the city is going to increasingly be a place where people want to live in and reside and do ministry, that's ended. And what happened is actually it was just a boomerang that, like often happens in the life cycle of big cities, when the pandemic came, people left, and then they came right back in greater number and with greater intensity. So real estate in London has never been more expensive than it was over the past year, post-pandemic. And I'm curious, what was Addis like? Not that as many people might have had mobility, but what was Addis like through the pandemic? Did the city stay roughly the same in terms of population? Did lots of people leave? What was your guys' experience? So people kind of just went on living. Gotcha. So it wasn't as disruptive as it was in other places. Yeah. Good. There's some other stuff here that I don't know that's super, super important, but it's basically saying that post-pandemic, one of the things that's happened in a lot of cities is that people's lives have become increasingly local. So rather than doing your life all over a city, you actually start to really connect with your neighbors, with local producers of things. I imagine that's true here. And so people's lives in cities, the enjoyment level is going up because they're living life more locally. Let me just give you one more quote about the importance of cities. In 1950, less than a third of the world's population lived in cities, but by 2020, the share has pushed past half. It's growing and growing at a clip equivalent to adding a new Chicago to the planet every 2 weeks. By 2050, the UN estimates that more than 2/3 of human beings will live in cities. In 1800, there were just 2 cities with at least 1 million inhabitants, London and Beijing. In 1900, there were around 15. By 2000, the number has soared to 371. And by 2030, it is projected to surpass 700. By then, the world can expect to have over 40 megacities, those with 10 million inhabitants or more. Many of them will be in Africa. So for you guys, as you're thinking about the future of your ministry, may I just commend to you the importance of cities for these reasons. We also should talk about this bottom of page 2, the influence and impact of cities. It is unchristian, it's a little snobby to have an attitude that is city elite, meaning cities are better than rural places. That's not necessarily true, but they might be more strategically important simply because of how many people are there and also because of how much culture is shaped in cities. Justin Buzzard and Stephen put it this way: if you want to see, I don't know how true this would be in Addis, but let's look at this quote anyway. Do you want to see the best in live theater? You have to go to the nearest urban center. You want to see your favorite sports team? They're in a city. Best symphony, museums, research, world-class restaurants, almost always in cities. Your mobile phone, e-reader, computer, household appliances, car, likely designed and produced in cities. More than ever before, as the city goes, so goes the culture. Let me ask you guys before we move on, what would you say are the main reasons why people move to Addis? What are the things that draw people from outside, whether it's other parts of Ethiopia or other parts of the world, to Addis? What would be the main factors? Opportunity. What kind of opportunity? So work, education. Good. Okay. Yeah, so work and education, huge. Same in London. What else? Anything else? Security? Security in what way? So you mean physical safety? Yeah, just like ancient cities. We come to the city because there's refuge. We come to the city because it's a place of safety. Absolutely. Good. Our quality of life? Say more about that. So if you're wealthy, you can come to the city, you can have more access to things that make your life more comfortable. At the same time, wouldn't that suggest that cities are also places of incredible inequality or inequity? So some people live really wealthily, others live with incredible poverty, and so one of the dynamics of city living is the disparity between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, and that's always a real challenge. Again, I'm just speaking about London, not because it affects you, but because it's my context. It's the city I know best. London has the 5th most billionaires on the planet, and it has the highest level of poverty in all of the United Kingdom. I mean, just think about that for a second. There's more people with more money than almost any city in the world, and we have more people who can't afford food than anywhere else in the entirety of the United Kingdom. That's extraordinary, but that's what cities do. They create incredible inequity, and that's opportunity for ministry. Let me just give you guys a little bit of what I just said is actually there. Come down with me, if you would, to page 4 in your handout. Did I mention yesterday? I feel like I did. This is just a case study about London, that London is becoming less secular. Did I say that yesterday? So the city is desecularizing. So far as I know, London is the only Western city for which that's true. But my suspicion is that because of secular 3, remember the thing we talked about yesterday, that lots of global cities are going to become less secular as time goes on. It doesn't mean necessarily that Christianity in the way we articulate it is going to grow, but it means that people's openness to spirituality is going to increase, not decrease. So let me give you a few examples from London. These are statistics, so let me just read them. But these numbers are fascinating to me. If you think about the fact that since 1980, London has become a more religious city, not less religious, that's a stunning thing. So here's a couple of stats that support that. The overall number of congregations in London has grown steadily for more than 30 years, from about 3,400 congregations to now 4,700, 2012. The total number of Sunday worshipers in all churches in London fell from 666,000 to 650 in 1989, and is, in the most recent survey, now just over 720,000. Notice this will be true in Addis, I'm sure. London's churchgoers are younger on average than churchgoers in the rest of England. 58% aged younger than 45. This is partly a reflection of London's young population, but it's striking that London churches mirrored that demographic quality in ways not found in other parts of Britain. Would that be true? Like on a Sunday in this room, what's the average age of a person coming? Do you have a large age disparity, or are people tending to be younger? 20-something. Younger. Why do you guys think that is? That's true at my church. It's true in London. Why do you guys think it's true here? Yeah, and we just saw that in that statistic from Toby and Peter, right? That actually the population here tends to be young. Yeah. I think there's an openness if we talk about, remember, deconstruction, people who are de-church, people who are feeling the cross pressure of, I want to have some kind of spirituality, but I don't want to be connected to the institutions that I've seen corruption or sort of shallow faith in. That creates a real openness for young people to explore. So just like in my city, I think in this city, a lot of the opportunity that you'll have for ministry and for formation is going to be with people who tend to be younger. Also, cities are diverse. I don't know what the diversity, I should ask you what the diversity looks like here, but we're going to talk a lot about that on Thursday. But cities are places that attract incredible diversity, and that creates opportunity for a gospel ministry because people are exposed to viewpoints and ideas that are not their own. And then new churches, church planting. Some of you know this. Have you guys done courses on church planting? You have, right? So I'm sure whoever led that course for you told you that when you plant a new church, the impact of that new church doesn't hurt existing churches, it strengthens them. So if you plant a church, the 3 churches nearby, if they're relatively similar in theology and gospel commitment, those churches actually get strengthened because the presence of that new church creates an energy in the sort of Christian or spiritual community in that area in which people get fired up and people have new ministry ideas. So church planting brings renewal at an outsized pace. And so in a city like London, and I hope in a city like Addis, as more and more churches are planted, the overall spiritual ecosystem of this city gets healthier because of the presence of new churches. It's also, by the way, a reason why churches don't need to be competitive, because we actually help each other when we start new churches. Some people ask me, why is London desecularizing? And I think you guys need to pay attention to these factors if this is going to be something that might represent itself in a place like Addis. One factor is migration and immigration. So people are coming to the city, and when they come, they bring with them faith and perspectives that are not, that were not otherwise there. In London, people come from, places that are outside of the UK, and they bring vibrant faith with them. And so part of the reason why the church is growing in my city is because of people arriving in my city. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is because cities can be incredibly stressful places to live. It's too expensive, it's hard to keep up with the pace of work, and they're also very transient. I mentioned to you guys earlier that the main identifying factor for somebody's emotional unwellness in my city is loneliness. So, and that's true because cities are so transient. Cities are places where people are always coming and always going. And the impact of that is churches become communities of almost like families of support that can help people land and find a home wherever, outside of the communities they've come from. So what I'm trying to say is the reason the church is growing is not just because people from the outside are coming, but because the church is offering a way of experiencing the challenges of the city in a community of people that can be supportive. And then finally, and this is what scholars don't really talk about, I think the church is growing in the city because the gospel is good news and the Spirit's moving. The Spirit's bringing a revival. And so my hope and prayer for your city would be that you guys catch a vision for what the gospel's doing here and that God breathes into that by the power of His Spirit, and you see renewal breaking out all over Addis. Why don't you guys open up your Bibles to Jonah chapter 4. Can someone summarize the story of Jonah for me real briefly? Not every verse, but just briefly. What's going on in the book of Jonah? What is Nineveh?
The capital of Assyria.
Big city. Look with me a couple things, if you would, in the book of Jonah. So I said turn to chapter 4, but just a couple things I want to call your attention to. During the Reformation, the book of Jonah was one of the main texts that the reformers used to inspire them, because it was about bringing the gospel to the city, even though sometimes it feels that the city doesn't deserve it. So much of the Reformation was influenced by the book of Jonah. So I'm talking about Martin Luther, Calvin, people like Bullinger, very significant text for them. I think it should be for us too. Jonah chapter 1 and verse 2, God tells Jonah to go to the great city of Nineveh. What do you think God means by great city of Nineveh? Big city, so density, maybe? Influential. Sort of a military hub, maybe a cultural hub, sure. Maybe also great need, a city that has tremendous need for people to know and follow God. God thinks Nineveh is great, maybe not great in terms of wonderful, but great in terms of importance. He says it again to Jonah in chapter 3 and verse 1, go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message that I give you. According to God, Nineveh is greatly important, and one of the challenges in Jonah's discipleship was Jonah did not share God's perspective of the city. Jonah looked at the city and saw evil, he saw crime, he saw wickedness, and God saw greatness. God saw great need, great opportunity, a great number of people. So the first question that Jonah causes us to ask is, do we see the city the way God does? Do we have great love for our city? Come with me now to chapter 4. God shows mercy on Nineveh. Jonah's ticked. And so chapter 4, the text says, to Jonah, this seemed very wrong that God would show mercy to Nineveh. He became angry. He prayed to the Lord, isn't this what I said when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. It's easy to mock Jonah. Basically he preaches the worst sermon in history and he has an incredible revival and his church is filled and he's upset about it. You think, come on, Jonah, what's your problem? But when you think about it more from the perspective of nationalism, for Jonah to see revival in the Ninevites was, in a sense, a betrayal of his own ethnic identity, because these were Israel's enemies. These were the people that had tried to hurt Israel, and Jonah hated them. What's interesting about this is love and mission in the city oftentimes does rub against some of our natural impulses, our desire for the people who we are just like, or the people that we know we have a lot in common with. The city is a place where it pushes us out, maybe not to hostile enemies, but to people who are deeply different. But those are the people that God sent Jonah to. Now Jonah's outside of the city. He's watching this revival break out. He's ticked off. So look what God says. Is it right for you to be angry? It's almost a rhetorical question, but look at Jonah. He goes down east of the city. He makes himself a shelter, sits in its shade, and he waits to see what would happen to the city. He's thinking, maybe they'll go back to their wicked ways. Maybe God will torch them. The Lord provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head, to ease his discomfort. Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die, and he said, it would be better for me to die than live. God said to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about this plant? And Jonah says, it is, and I'm so angry I wish I were dead. Kind of seems like God is talking to a toddler. But what's happening here? And then we'll come to the last two verses, which is the heart of what I want to unpack with you. Jonah's upset at God's mercy. And Jonah is annoyed that God has been kind to a city that he thought deserved judgment. So he goes outside of the city and he's looking at the city, just hoping that something terrible will come. And God, in his kindness, makes a plant to give Jonah shade. This is a desert place. It's hot. The sun is powerful, and Jonah is relieved to have some shade. Do you notice what's happening? Jonah is more thankful for a plant than he is that God is showing mercy to people. And that reveals the inordinate directions of Jonah's love. Tim Keller used to say that God loves people more than plants. And there are more people than plants in the city, so God must really love cities. Jonah didn't get that. Jonah's upset because the plant was destroyed when he wanted to see Nineveh destroyed. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight, and it died overnight. Should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? What God's saying is your love is inordinate. It's out of the right direction because you care more about the plant than the city that's filled with people. But God says, I have concern. That Hebrew word is tough to translate. Sometimes it means pity. It's the kind of feeling you have when someone that you love deeply is doing something or experiencing something that's hurting them. It's what you feel for them in that moment. And God's saying to Jonah, isn't that how I should feel for Nineveh? That's the kind of love or pity or concern or compassion that I have for this great city. Once again, calling it great. And the way God defines greatness here is by its density. This is a huge city. 120,000 people is not much to us, but for an ancient city, that was extraordinary. God's telling Jonah, I have a great love for this great city. And if you're really my follower, if you're my disciple, you should too. And my hope is that as you guys wrap up this year, as you continue to serve with this church and think about your future ministries, whether it's church planting or serving existing churches, that you will have God's heart for your city, that you will love the city the way God calls you to, the way that Jesus modeled. Because Jesus too looked over a wicked city. But unlike Jonah, Jesus didn't weep because he lost a plant. Jesus wept because he knew the city was lost. But he gives himself in love to see that city saved and renewed. And that's what he constantly does in and through Christians who live in big cities today. All right, guys, so what we're doing now is shifting from the biblical foundation for apologetics, and we're in a kind of intermission zone where we're talking about the things we need to have in our minds as we prepare to talk about how to engage the culture. And one of the things we did are look at some of the main cultural pressures or obstacles, things like secularism or deconstruction, apathy and individualism. We also want to talk about cities because cities are the context in which culture is formed and which culture is engaged in. And so what I want to do now, and we'll see how long this takes, we may be able to add some other stuff later this afternoon, is talk about what it looks like or what it looks like to be a church for the city. I don't just mean a church in the city, but a church for the city. Another way to say that is, how does God want Christians to engage with their cities? That's what we want to talk about now, because this is going to shape how we talk about and process what it means to engage with culture, since cities are culture-producing machines. So the best place in the Bible that I know of to talk about what God wants for his people related to the cities they live in is Jeremiah 29. So can you guys open your Bibles to Jeremiah 29? Jeremiah 29 is an interesting passage in Israel's history because what had happened was, as you know, the Babylonians had captured or taken into exile many people from Jerusalem. And there was a false prophet, his name is Hananiah, and he wrote to the people who had been carried into exile. And he said basically this: don't worry, the exile's not going to take very long. You're going to be home again soon. And the impact of Hananiah's letter was that the Jewish people living in Babylon who were carried there by exile stayed disconnected from the city. They said, this isn't our home, this is an evil, wicked place, and we're going to be home soon, so let's live in isolation from the city. Let's not get very connected. God tells Jeremiah we need to correct that false teaching. We need to correct that false idea. So God tells Jeremiah to write a letter to the exiles who are in Babylon from Jerusalem to give them God's heart and God's perspective for how his people should relate to the big bad city of Babylon. That's what we see in Jeremiah 29. Let me read the text, and then I'm going to give you guys a quick exercise to set up our time together. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and the priests, the prophets, and all the people that Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiachin and the queen mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the skilled workers and the artisans had gone into exile. He entrusted the letter to Elash, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, now verse 4 is God's letter to the exile. So where you are, privately, I want you to read carefully verses 4 through 9, and I want you to take notes, jot down some replies, answers to this question. How does God want his people to relate to the big city? How does God want his people to relate to the city? What things does he want them to do? What practices is he calling them to participate in? What attitude should they have towards the city? What things does he want them to do? What practices should they have? What kind of attitude should they have towards the city that they're exiles in? So look carefully at that. Take a few minutes, verses 4 through 9. Jot down some notes, and then we'll discuss it together and talk about it. What were some of your thoughts on the text and some of your responses to those questions that we all got to think about? Yeah, good. We'll talk more about that in a second, but you're emphasizing their spiritual needs. The welfare of the city isn't just practical or physical, it's spiritual. Absolutely. What'd you guys see? Good, very good. You're seeing the sort of creation mandate, the cultural mandate, re-expressed here in Jeremiah 29, because God's people are living life now in a new context, and they need to reapply this ancient command. It's really good. You guys have summarized all the main themes of the things that I want to talk about. So I'm going to, in the time that we have, just with the handout that's in front of you, try to summarize some of these big themes and impress upon you the importance. So here's two things that I want to communicate to you today. Your own sense of calling to the city is something you want to care for and cultivate. And you need to see part of your pastoral responsibility for people as you have shepherding responsibilities in your future is to help them develop a vision for what life in the city can look like. Living in the city is challenging, and so they need you, their pastors and shepherds, to help them develop a biblical vision for what living in the city can and should look like as the people of God. So this is all stuff to help you cultivate and care for your calling, but also to help you help others in developing that sense of call to the city. Three things that I want to draw out in terms of how this passage shapes the way we live in the city. You've said most of these things. I'm just going to flesh it out and add to it. First, God tells his people, basically, be rooted in your city. Put down roots. Verse 5, build houses and settle down. That phrase, build houses, while you and I might read it quickly, ancient Hebrews would have read that and seen God telling them to have some kind of permanent presence in the city. Because when you were staying somewhere temporarily, what did you set up? Tents. The people of God were used to living in tents. But when God says build houses, he's saying, I want you to live in Babylon as if you're home. Like this is home and you're not going anywhere. I want you to have a mindset shift from transience to embeddedness. I want you to be rooted in the city. And that's important. I don't know enough about Addis to know just how transient it is, but I know in my city, I imagine here, lots of people will come to the city to get something from it. Once they've got it, they'll leave. Or once they encounter challenges like having kids, which you know about, these guys, you know, then you might be tempted to leave because you say, we can't do it, we can't afford it, it's too, you have a kid, right? Yeah, so you know too. When people encounter challenges, the tendency is to say, we've got to leave the city. But we're never going to serve our city, we're never going to be Christians, we're never going to be churches that engage with the culture, that see renewal, that see people come to know Jesus, if we don't have a mindset of rootedness in our city. That we live as if we are home. That while you're there, be all there. Be fully committed. Now I know some of you won't live in Addis for the rest of your life, but while you live in Addis, you should live as if you're home. You should be really rooted. That attitude, once you have it, shapes the way you relate to your city. Because when something is home, you care for it in a different way. It's the reason why, if you're home and something breaks, you feel an urgency to see it restored, to see it fixed. But if you're staying maybe at a hotel or something like that, you know that someone else is going to come and take care of that for you. That's someone else's responsibility. When you're seeing the city as home, you feel ownership to see renewal happen in this place. So the first thing God says, while you're there in Babylon, be all there. Live as if you're home. Be rooted in the city. And so you need to discern what that means for you in your ministry futures. You also need to discern how you're going to help people face the challenges of living in the city, but to really adopt a posture of rootedness. Second, work for the good of the city. If the first thing God says is, I want you to have a rooted mindset, the second thing God says is, I want you to work for the city's good. And here's what's interesting. You both in this group over here talked about the impact God's people should have. So plant gardens, build families. So here's my question. Is planting a garden a sacred or a secular function? What do you guys think? It's kind of a trick question, right?
Use that divide.
Yeah, we don't want to use the divide. But traditionally, you would think of planting a garden, right, as something that's not overly spiritual. Anyone can do it, it's planting a garden. Then God also says, I want you to pray for your city, which is a very spiritual function. That's the role of a priest, to bring the city to God and bring God to the people, bring the city to God in prayer and bring God to the city in evangelism. Very priestly function. What God's saying to the people is, I want you to work for the social and spiritual good of your city. I want you to be agents of flourishing. I want you to seek the renewal, or the Hebrew word, the peace and prosperity. The Hebrew word behind peace and prosperity is shalom. And the reason I like peace and prosperity is because when you and I think of the word peace, which is sometimes how the word shalom is translated, we think of an absence of conflict or the cessation of hostility. If a country isn't at war, it's at peace. But biblically speaking, shalom is not just the cessation of conflict, it's the presence of right relationships between all people and all things. A city in shalom is a city in which there's no injustice, a city in which everyone has what they need, a city in which people are flourishing, a city even in which the creation itself is, you might say, alive and healed. Shalom is goodness in every aspect of life. And God says to his people, in your city, I don't want you to have just a spiritual function or just a secular or a social one. I want you to seek the whole city's holistic good, to have a spiritual and a secular or a sacred duty to your city. And he actually goes on to unpack what that would look like. Verse 6, God tells his people, build community. Now it's interesting because God says, I want you to get married, have sons and daughters, increase in number. As Brian said, that's right. That's a restatement of the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But here's what's interesting. Marriages don't spring out of nowhere. The way you end up marrying somebody, even in a traditional society, is you have families and groups of people who are in relationships together as friends. And from that emerges marriages and families. And so what God is telling his people, I want you, part of your good impact in the city is I want you to be a community-centered people. I want you to build community in your city with each other in your faith space, but also with neighbors and with friends. I want you to be deeply invested in the relationships that you have with the people around you, so that from those relationships and those friendships, we can see life starting to emerge. So God says, build community, get into relationship. Don't isolate yourself from the other people in the city. I loved earlier when I learned that most of you go to the same gym. What an opportunity for building community and for thinking about how the gospel can be made known in that space. Next thing God says, but this is down in verse 5, God says, I want you to plant gardens and eat what they produce. Now, what does a garden do? Gardens always do two things. They provide food, which nourishes bodies, but they also provide beauty, which nourishes the soul. You know, gardens are good for eating. You get fruit, you get vegetables, but they're also beautiful to be in. The flowers, the color, the change. Just walking in a garden sometimes heals your soul because it's beautiful. God's saying to his people, I want you to do things that nourish human life and that create beauty which heals the soul. I want you to be engaged in that kind of work in our city. And one of the things, and we're going to talk a lot about this on the last day that we're together, one of the reasons why this is really important is because most of you are training to be pastors. You're going to do spiritual leadership. You're going to stand up here. You're going to do preaching and teaching. You're going to do pastoral counseling, etc. And what sometimes happens, because the pastors are the ones who have the most vocal voices in their churches, is that even accidentally, we communicate a perception of spirituality that the most spiritual and the most mature Christians are the ones who work for the churches and are engaged in full-time professional ministry. And we create an expectation that if you're really serious about Jesus, then you yourself are going to adopt and assume some of the very same ways of serving God. What passages like this help us realize is that actually, while never minimizing the importance of pastoral work, I'm doing this because I know it's important. You guys will too. But what we want to help our people realize is that their work in the city is no less important for God's plan to see renewal in the city. That whenever anyone is working to build communities that nourish bodies, that care for people's needs, and also creates beauty which heals soul, those are all ways in which we can advance the evangelistic reality of the gospel in our city. And so it isn't the case that the pastors do the sacred work and everyone else does the secular work. Actually, we need to recover a vision, like God's telling the people, that all of your jobs and all of your vocations can be spiritual in the sense that they can be used to point people to God. And you need to give your people a vision for how their work is actually going to be part of God's renewal of your city. We'll talk a lot about that on Thursday, a lot more about that. But that's effectively what God is saying, is I want you to do things in the city that provide good and flourishing for all the inhabitants that are here. Does that make sense? Okay. So then the last thing God says to the people, again, just by way of summary, is I want you to stand out in the city. Be rooted, work for the good, and stand out. That is to say, look distinct. Be in your city, but don't look just like your city. So God says, I want you to pray for the city. That's a distinctly spiritual function. That's something only God's people can do. And so we see the balance that on one hand, God's people are to be rooted, they're to have a sense of embeddedness, they're to build friendships and relationships in the city. They know the culture of the city. But on the other hand, they look different than the city. They have a distinct identity. So you avoid isolation, but also accommodation. You don't look just like the city, you don't avoid it altogether. You have this unique identity as God's people, which creates, you might say, a vision of an alternate city. What every church that's gospel-centered and Addis should be is a picture to Addis of what life looks like under the lordship of Christ. You're meant, as a church, to give Addis a vision of an alternate city, a city that is filled with love and justice and joy and peace, and ultimately lived in submission to God. That's what God is telling his people. I want you to be an alternate city in Babylon. The way Jesus talked about that very same call, and this has everything to do with cultural engagement, is the call to be salt and light. Salt, deeply embedded. It can't be effective if it's not deeply embedded in the meat. But also, light, deeply distinct from the darkness that it's piercing. If you're not deeply embedded and deeply distinct, you're not going to be the kind of disciples that engage the culture the way Jesus is calling you to. That's what God is telling Jeremiah. That's what Jesus says. The dual images of salt and light are intended to portray two aspects of witness that are not easy to balance, though they must be: engagement and distinctiveness. As salt, Jesus' disciples must engage the world, but as light, they must never allow their engagement to lead to compromise of kingdom values and their assimilation to the world. So that's the balance that God's calling you to. That's the balance that God's helping you or wants you to help your people recover and have a vision for. So finally, how can a church be in and for their city? How can we do this? A couple of things, and some of this is reflective of my own church and things we've been working through. But as I thought about them for today, I think these ideas can actually be very useful for any church that's seeking to be very a Jeremiah 29 presence in their city. So some values. Number one, a commitment to prayer, to stand in the breach, to recognize that God's work is accomplished not by might, but by power and by his Spirit. So you can't really seek the shalom of the city if you're not a radically praying people. Second, serve the city. You know the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the man is left for dead, and it's the Samaritan who comes along to help. What I love about that story is the man is incredibly helpful to the person who's left for dead, but he does so in non-paternalistic ways. Does that phrase mean anything to you? Non-paternalistic. I'll try to say it this way. Sometimes people with resources help people who are marginalized in ways that create a real relational barrier, so that I am always the person helping you rather than there being a mutuality, a kind of friendship that emerges between the person doing the helping and the person being helped. So sometimes when you have resources or opportunity to serve, you look at those people that you're serving as just that, people who need help, rather than as people who are made in the image of God, who you can learn with and from, even though you might have something to give. What the gospel does, and what you see in Luke 10, is it gives us ways to serve the city that remind us we are both needy and needed. We have something to offer, but we also need from others. So we serve the city in ways that are humble, that doesn't feel condescending to the people that we're serving, but sees them as people made in the image of God with dignity and worth celebrating. Reconciliation, I put here racial justice, but I recognize that that may not be as much of a factor in a place like Addis, although I do expect that whether it's religious or ethnic or tribal, there are differences and divisions in a community like this. We'll talk more about that on Thursday. But my goodness, one of the ways you serve your city is by showing how the gospel brings unity amid difference. We'll talk a lot more about this on Thursday, but faith and work. We believe that the gospel should impact our whole lives. So most people spend most of their time working. And therefore, you want to give your people a vision for how the thing they do with most of their time can be used for the glory of God. You don't want to create an attitude that the most important things that happen in a person's spiritual life only happen inside the walls of the church building. You want them to see every blade of grass as being the dominion of the King. And then, of course, nurturing families and relationships. I put this on here because I've lived in big cities long enough to know, just like Brian was saying, my wife and I talk about this all the time. We'd love for our daughter to do more swimming. We'd love for her to do more playing, like ballet. It's expensive. It's hard because space is a premium. And to have the space and to have the teachers, it costs money. We can't let our daughter run outside because if she runs outside, she'll get hit by a double-decker red bus. It's hard to live in a city because space, and it's hard to raise a family, and a lot of people leave. So if you're going to be a church that thrives in the city, you've got to nurture families and relationships. You've got to create a sense of, another way to say it, lots of people, I think you're probably an example, Brian, you came to the city, but coming to the city meant you left your own biological family. So your kids don't have their grandparents anymore or their aunts and uncles. So what do they need? They need the church to step in and be that. So you have to give your community a vision of what the church's family really looks like to make life in the city sustainable. And then what I would call winsome evangelism, crystal clear on the gospel, but winsome in the sense that you are being respectful and creative in how you present the gospel. We've been talking about this. It says here, talking about subversive fulfillment, which is the basis of your assignment. But that's going to have to be the strategy for effective evangelism in our cities. The question that I always wonder is how could God's people have done this? They missed Jerusalem. They wanted to go back home. Living in the city was hard. Probably the Babylonians weren't always receptive. So how could they do it? And the answer comes a little bit later in the passage. God says to his people, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you, and I will fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. And then down to verse 14, God says, I will gather you from all the nations and the places where I've banished you, and I'll bring you back to the place where I carried you into exile. In effect, God's saying to the people, I want you to live in Babylon as though you're home. I want you to be fully rooted there, mostly. But as my people, while you live in Babylon, I want you to hear my future promise that one day I'm going to come and I'm going to bring you back to your true home, your ultimate home. And there you'll be safe. There your heart will be ultimately healed. And so, right now, you need to live in Babylon as though this is the city that you belong to. But recognize that ultimately you are made for another home, and I will carry you back from exile. That sounds a lot like Jesus in John 14, saying to his disciples, in my Father's house there are many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that where you are, that you may also be where I am. God says to his people in Jeremiah 29, I'm going to bring you home. And he was talking about Jerusalem. But Jesus says to his disciples, I'm going to bring you to your ultimate home. And that promise is what fuels life in the city for today. The promise that our ultimate true home is with God and his kingdom forever is the promise that helps me be more present in my city, that will help you be more present in your city today than you could have ever otherwise been. I'll give you this example. You don't know this about me, but I don't really like camping. I've done a lot of camping. I've done some intense camping, and I don't like it. I just don't enjoy it for whatever reason. It's just not my thing. But the few times that I've been camping, I've been able to have a good time. I've enjoyed the challenge. I've built good friendships with the people I was with. I saw beautiful things. So I had the best time I could. But the thing that allowed me to enjoy that experience was that I knew it wasn't permanent. I knew that eventually I would get to go home. I knew that my bed was waiting for me, that I wouldn't have to eat food that wasn't very good, but you're so hungry it tastes amazing anyway. I knew that I'd be home. And what the promise of home did is it actually fueled me to enjoy my experience camping, because I knew that this camping experience couldn't satisfy the deep longings of my heart. So instead of putting my head down and hating it, I could actually just enjoy it for what it was and not look to it to be something that it could never be in the first place. What Jesus is saying, in effect, is, I'm going to come and bring you home. That's the heart, that's the home that your heart has been seeking, the kingdom of God. And if you know that, then you're actually more free to love and serve and engage with your city right now in a way that you never otherwise could have been. You see, if you don't know that the kingdom is coming, then you look to this city to give you everything you need in life, because what hope do you have? But if you recognize that your ultimate home is with God and his kingdom, then you're free to stop looking to Addis to heal the biggest longings of your soul. And instead, you're free to love and serve the people around you and work to make this a more wholesome city for all its inhabitants. C.S. Lewis put it this way: hope is one of the theological virtues. Hope means a continual looking forward to the eternal world, not as a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things that a Christian is meant to do. It does not mean that we leave the present world as it is. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this one. He's right. He says later in that same chapter, if you aim at earth, you get not heaven or earth. But if you aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in. So the encouragement for us is if we're going to be a people who really love and serve our city, it's because we look forward to the ultimate city, the permanent city, the city whose builder and maker is God, the city that has foundations. So here's what I want to do. Let me just again try to orient you to the big picture of what we've been talking about this week, because I think this big picture is helpful so that you can see the trees and the forest as we journey through our time together. So we started off by talking about what is apologetics, and that's sort of a big topic. What does it mean historically, academically, but then also practically? We then spent some time talking about what are some of the big challenges, especially in your context, to helping people encounter the gospel. So those were the conversations about the Orthodox Church or Islam or deconstruction, secularism, etc. We've just spent some time talking about the city, and the city is important as the context for all of our cultural engagement, all of our apologetics. The city informs what we should do. What I want to start doing now, and what we'll do for the rest of today, and then for probably all of tomorrow, is talk about culture. And then the last day, what we'll do is we'll spend time talking about what it means for pastors to do apologetics and engage culture in every aspect of their ministry. Why don't we spend some time now talking amongst ourselves about culture as we understand it? So here's a question, just in the groups, the people near you. I want you to talk about this question. What is culture? Very hard question to answer, but take a stab at it. What is culture? And second question, what are examples of culture? What are things that you would say that's an example of culture in our city? So what is culture? Do your best to try to define it. And then what are examples of culture that you would see in a place like Addis? So take a few minutes, let's talk about it. We'll have that conversation, we'll see where we are, and if we want to press on into the material. So we're going to start now talking about culture. And I think that what I want to do is start our discussion by hearing from you all. And then I think what we'll do is maybe spend some time in Genesis before we actually get to the material in our handout. I'll just say, I've been thinking about this for a while, as I'm sure you have, and culture is really hard to define. You might have experienced that even as you were just talking about it. So it's worth trying to get at a definition, but actually realizing that culture is it's almost like an atmosphere, than it is a thing. But let's talk about it. So why don't we start here? What did you guys talk about? Like what's your best attempt at defining culture? What are things that represent or manifest culture in a city like Addis? Okay, so culture is the thing that kind of animates a community of people that live together. Is that kind of what you're saying? It's the values that guide a community. It's the thing that shapes what we do and even how we think. Is that right? Okay. But yeah, I've distracted us. Your point is like the clothes people wear is an example of culture. Absolutely. Good. So, but let's try to, because again, this is the complexity of defining culture. You're saying it's a set of values that animate people, a group of people?
Circles.
Yes. So that's one of the challenges of talking about culture, is that actually often talking about cultures, plural, that it's hard, like in a city like Addis, is there one culture? There's 100? It's hard to define. You guys? Yeah, like friendships matter a great deal. Yeah, that's very good. So what you've just done is you've defined a couple of things that make life in Addis function. So here, if you're not hospitable, you stand out in a negative way, right? That would be true, right? It's a shame and honor culture. So whatever it is that you're supposed to be honoring, if you're not, you're made to feel less than. There's a beautiful element of we prioritize friendship over productivity. So the person in front of me is more important than getting my job done or whatever that might be as an example. Those are good examples of culture. And what's really interesting is that most of those things, and this is a key for culture, are caught more than they are taught. Probably most of your parents never sat you down and said, okay, we're going to be hospitable today. This is what hospitality means. You just picked it up along the way. And you learned that to be Ethiopian or to be a person who lives in Addis or whatever is someone who's hospitable. It was caught more than it was taught. That's a huge part of culture. You also use the word worldview. We're going to talk a lot about that tomorrow. Very important word. I think worldview might be one of the closest words to get at a definition of culture. It's not exactly the same, but they're so interrelated that it could be almost the best other word to describe culture. So really good reflections, guys. What about over here? Good. So it's very interesting. I love how you guys are giving these examples because these are the kinds of examples that really illustrate the point that culture is easier to experience than it is to define. Like if you're someone who has a Kenyan background and then you come to a place and now you're in Ethiopia, you experience differences and you say, wow, that's so different. But to the people who are used to them, they feel so normal. And that's why sometimes when you cross a culture, you feel yourself more aware of your own culture. So when I moved to London, I felt things about being an American that I never felt before because I was in a new culture. I was in a new place, and that new place helped me see my old place in a new way. Talking about culture would be like asking a fish in a fish tank, where is the water? Well, you know, what would the fish say? Like the fish would say, huh? Like, what do you mean? Like, what's water? You know, the fish doesn't, it's the fish's environment, it's his atmosphere, it's everything to him. It's hard for him to articulate because he lives in it all the time. So what we need to learn how to do as pastors is to be able to sort of, through the help of wise people, but also friends, and sometimes actually getting out of our culture for a minute, is actually to have lenses by which we can see, oh, the things that felt so normal are actually cultural. They're just part of what it means to be part of this community at this time in space and history. Really significant. Anything else that anyone wants to add about culture and examples of it? I'm curious, none of you said, it's so funny, the examples you gave, which were great, like hospitality and relationship and just an example about funerals, but nobody said anything about the people making media or music or food. Are there parts of Addis where if I went to this evening, it would be bumping? You know, there would be restaurants filled, there'd be music happening, there'd be people participating in life together. I mean, there must be, right? Yeah, so that's all culture, you know. No, who's producing culture in Addis right now? Like, who are the people that are shaping people? Who are the people that are informing the imaginations of teenagers? What songs are people listening to? What movies or shows are they watching? Is it happening here? Is it being imported from other parts of the world? Yeah, so mostly through computers and phones, culture's coming in from the outside. Okay, that's helpful. I think what I'm trying to do is, because tomorrow and Thursday we'll talk a lot about the practical stuff related to culture, I'm trying to ascertain what's going on here in terms of experiences of culture. So let me ask you guys this question. On a Sunday morning when this room is filled with people, what are the main kind of jobs that the people in this room have? Is there a dominant? Is everyone doing something different? What are the jobs or the vocations like of the people who are part of your church? Okay, that's interesting. That's very helpful for me to know because that's going to inform how you guys pastor. I mean, think about the complexity of that vision for rootedness in the city with this impulse in the culture to say we're kind of wanting to spread our wings and go elsewhere for more opportunities. And that's also related to questions of poverty and challenge of living in the city. If people want jobs and can't find them, if it's hard to get above the poverty line, those are real challenges that pastors in the city will have to face because the call to renew the culture is the same for you as it is for me, but your challenges might be different. So that's really helpful for me to know. Let's go to Genesis 1. I want to just show you what's sometimes called the cultural mandate. So when we come to Genesis 1, we see God effectively. I mean, Genesis 1 is a really rich chapter, and there's a lot going on here. But in this chapter, you have what are sometimes called the creation mandate and the cultural mandate. And you see these mandates repeated throughout the Bible, and sometimes they're restated. Some people say, for example, even Jesus' Great Commission is a restatement of the cultural mandate. But let's look. Come with me to Genesis 1, and let's start in verse 24. God said, "Let the land produce living creatures, livestock." Verse 25, God made the wild animals according to their kinds. God saw that it was good. Verse 26, God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, so that they may rule," very important word, "over the fish, over the birds, over the livestock, over the animals, over all the creatures on the ground." God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Verse 28, creation mandate. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, subdue it." Cultural mandate. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Verse 29, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food." A little farther, "Everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food," and it was so. Genesis 2, God gives Adam and Eve the mandate of working and caring for the garden. Look with me, if you would, at verse 8 of Genesis 2. "Now the Lord God had planted a garden east of Eden, and there he put man he had formed. The Lord God made all kinds of trees grow up out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food." By the way, remember what we said earlier about planting gardens? Pleasing to the eye, beautiful, good for food, nourishing to the body. In the middle of the garden there was the tree of life. A river was there in the garden. God, verse 15, put the man in the garden to work it and take care of it. Now, it's so easy to read these chapters and to miss the force of them, right? They're in Eden, they're in paradise, there's a garden, there's just trees and plants everywhere, there's a nice river. It doesn't look like this. Do you realize that what God is giving Adam and Eve is a cultural mandate? He's saying to them, in effect, there's all this raw material in creation, and I want you to work, to cultivate, to tend, and to steward the raw materials of creation to bring about flourishing for other people. That's literally the charge that God gives to Adam and Eve. And let me show you this. 2:15, "The Lord God took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." God gave Adam a job in paradise. When you think about paradise or a holiday or vacation, what do you think of? You think of maybe a beach or a pool, maybe something yummy to drink, maybe someone bringing you those yummy drinks. You think of resting and relaxing, at least I do. In paradise, God gives Adam a job. And more than that, remember, Genesis 2 happens before Genesis 3. Genesis 3, sin comes into the world. But in a world prior to and apart from sin, human beings are still called to work, to cultivate, to steward the raw materials of creation to contribute to human flourishing. This is the cultural mandate. And so when we think about culture today, we don't necessarily think of it in terms of agriculture, but it's just because the materials are different. Now we're called to steward money, ideas, law, art, so that human beings can flourish and experience wholeness on this earth. This is the cultural mandate. And it would be wrong. This is why, by the way, I'm sad to know about your congregation and jobs in this city. To not have work, to want to work and not have the opportunity is really hard. It's almost dehumanizing. Because when God makes human beings, he gives them, as part of their creational order, a job to do, which is really to reflect God's creative order and helping this world flourish with all the beauty that God put into it. So this is the cultural mandate. This is why, even though tomorrow we're not going to, at least initially, talk a ton about Scripture, this is why we talk about cultural renewal. Because of the cultural mandate that God gives on the second chapter, the second page of the Bible. And now our challenge is to say culture looks a lot different than it did in the Garden of Eden. So what does faithful cultural renewal look like for disciples of Jesus today in a city like this?